Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. A very warm welcome to today's webinar, sponsored by IBS Intelligence in association with Fiorano. The topic of the webinar today is solving the ISO 20022 migration conundrum. This is where we will be discussing the various challenges faced by banks and financial institutions when embarking on this migration, which is fairly complex. Now, of course, we will also be looking at the various approaches and strategies that banks and financial institutions need to consider to be able to tackle these challenges. Now, my name is Vipin. I am the Senior Lead Analyst at IBS Intelligence, and joining me is a distinguished group of panelists with substantial experience in the payments services, payments infrastructure, and payments technology industry. It is my pleasure to introduce you to Alenka Pham from NLB Bank. Alenka is the Director of Payments at NLB. Andrew Muir from SWIFT. Andrew is the ISO 20022 Program Community Engagement Lead. Biju Suresh Babu, who is the Managing Director at Fiorano Software. Biju heads the Banking and Financial Services vertical. And Daniel Kassar, who is the Head of Digital Innovation at APS Bank. Welcome, everyone. The webinar will be for a duration of 1 hour, which will include the discussion and a Q&A session towards the end. We might also be able to give, depending on the time, have a polling question for the audience to participate. The Q&A is open to everyone to start putting in your questions right from now till the end of the webinar, and we will take up the Q&A discussion towards the end. Of course, if there are questions which are unanswered, we will take them offline and we will respond to each of these. One other thing is the webinar is live, but it will be available as a recorded event post the webinar. So anyone who's missed out or your colleagues who've missed out, please do feel free to share this link with them. We will make them available to all the participants. Right, now, without further ado, I want to, let's start with the ISO 20022 migration conundrum. Now, it's important before we dive right into the challenges that we set the context here, and more important, the timelines that banks and financial institutions need to work towards. Now, there are already over 70 countries who are already using ISO 20022. And as we speak, I think over 200 market infrastructures that are working towards the ISO 20022 transition. Now, the biggest driver here is, of course, SWIFT, which announced its decision to enable ISO 20022 by December 2022. It's important to note that the deadline was November 2021 before, and it's been extended by a year. And of course, now banks have that breathing space, if I may say so. And in line with the SWIFT's deadline and the timeline, again, one important thing to highlight is the end date for the complete transition to ISO 20022 remains 2025, which means banks have around 3 years when they can coexist with the MT standards and the new ISO 2022 standards. But post that, SWIFT will basically disable the ISO, the MT standards. So that's important for banks to consider. Now, of course, there are all the other important market infrastructure providers who are aligning to these timelines and working towards the deadlines. Now, at this point, I want to bring in Andrew Muir from SWIFT to take us through some of these timelines. And a couple of questions, Andrew, to you is one, the extension. What is the rationale behind SWIFT extending the deadline, and how can banks actually take advantage of this? Can they afford to relax? And if not, then what are the strategies that they need to consider?
Thanks very much, Vipin. I must say, I'm new to the concept of a relaxed banker these days. I think that's an unusual idea. Yeah, let's focus absolutely, as you suggest, on the timelines. As you pointed out, by November of 2025, MTs in categories 1, 2, and 9 will be removed from the FIN network for almost all use cases. There are some exceptions. Corporates and banks who exchange payment instructions in our SCORE service are not affected by this program. And exchanges with market infrastructures using closed user groups on FIN using MTs, again, will be supported for the foreseeable future. But if you are used to sending or receiving MT103s, MT202s, MT940s, MT950s on the open network, you absolutely are in the scope of this program. And by November of 2025, you need to have moved those flows from MT to ISO 20022. You can start using those new message types defined by the CBPR Plus group in November of 2022. So exactly as you say, there's a 3-year transition program. And early indications are that large intermediaries will indeed have the capability to exchange payment, transaction, and statement information with you as early as November of 2022. So we have until then to learn a whole new language. And I say that with a certain amount of weight, because actually every single piece of business terminology that we use today to describe the detail of payment transactions is changing. The structure of payment instructions is changing. CBPR Plus messages don't look like MTs. And the translation rules, for those of you who have not yet had a chance to explore them on our translation portal on the My Standards platform, can be complex. So actually learning this new language of ISO 20022 is not a small thing. It's something that we need to plan for, something that we provide considerable resources to help you with, but nonetheless needs to happen. We do have 2 years to do it. And of course, the learning curve will continue all the way through the 3-year transition program. But of course, learning a new language cannot be what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do as a community is turbocharge the payments process. We all want to be able to think more in terms of transactions than payments. Payments happen because of some other economic activity. And if we've learned anything at all about what our customers' expectations are of the payments process in the last decade or so, it is that the movement of money and the commercial transaction which led to the movement of money somehow have to be more integrated if we're going to deliver on the promise of what the World Wide Web, what the fintechs, and what our customers are really expecting us to do. So we came to the conclusion about a year ago that the job of moving from MT to ISO 20022, whilst good, wasn't good enough. Messaging has served us well over the last 4 years, but we needed more as a community. And that's why we announced back in March of this year the new transaction management concept. We're going to be introducing a transaction manager as part of our platform in November of 2022. That is going to maintain and store an immutable record of each payment transaction, which of course will be fully available to all of the actors who have permission to see it. The idea here is that we can deliver a much bigger platform for innovation than just changing the messaging standard. And part of the rationale for moving the start date of the transition period, of course, is to give us and the community a little more time to build out our vision, to build, of course, the technology, and to integrate it with today's existing processes. So that's really the first part of the question. I think to answer the second part of the question, which is, of course, to do with the the methodology, the recommended way forward, I see really three phases, one of which is just learning the new language. The second, I think, is figuring out how each individual bank fits its business onto the new rails. And the third, of course, is the planning of the infrastructure changes, everything from commissioning to architecture through to building implementation, and of course, the various different levels of testing in time for November of 2025. One feature of the change that we have made, which I really think needs me to illustrate it a bit, is that, of course, as a result of this change, banks can move to ISO 20022 at something much closer to their own preferred pace. Before March, before our concept of the transaction manager came along, every bank may have been receiving ISO 20022 payment instructions from the first day of the transition window. This way, the new way, banks will be able to move to ISO 20022 at the point of that transition window that makes sense to them. So the adoption curve, I think, is much easier to plan for most institutions. Vipin, did I answer your question?
Yes, perfectly. And I think from what I can understand, and I'm sure the audience would gather, is this is a fairly complex transition. And, the key word here is learning a new language. And that is so important for banks too, because a lot of banks we are seeing are just looking at this as minimum compliance rather than looking at this as a long-term strategy. And the reality is that ISO 20022 will become the de facto standard going forward. And I remember reading about it, and that in the next 5 years, I think by 2025 or rather, that almost 80% of the transactions are expected to be complying to ISO 20022. Would that be correct?
That would be absolutely right. And in fact, I suspect the percentage of value will be even higher than that, since it's the reserve reserve currencies that are really in the forefront of market infrastructure movements towards ISO 20022. And whilst I think it's perfectly okay for us to talk about this as a new language for payments, for me, I think it's even deeper than that. As a standardizer, I make no apology in being something of a purist. My vision is that the natural language of financial transactions, extending across the spectrum of payments, securities, trade, foreign exchange, treasury, and not just the interaction between banks, but the interactions between functions within banks and customers is actually what we're trying to implement. So gone will be the days when we have to integrate several different incompatible data lakes in order to gain an insight from previous customer transaction behavior. The idea that we have is that every application will be talking the same language and therefore storing its valuable data in the same language, which will make the job of integrating the different data pools that we have today that much easier. And of course, what that will do is make it so much easier to extract the valuable information lying in these data pools, which will help us innovate products and services faster and more effectively for everybody's benefit. So it is unashamedly a purist's point of view, but I like to think that in 20 years' time, we will be probably slightly more grey-haired, but we will also be congratulating ourselves on being able to do things that we simply can't do today.
Right, and completely agree with that vision. But to be able to reach that vision, I think the reality is a lot of banks are facing many challenges now. Now, we've looked at the top 5 challenges that we see are big hurdles for banks to be able to make this transition. The first one is really about the prioritization. We've seen banks already, mulling over this because, they already have multiple projects that are running parallelly, and ISO 20022 by no means is a small project. It's a complex, large-scale migration, and for that, it's about managing all your internal projects along with the external projects, and then look at how ISO 20022 fits into all of this. And the other part is, of course, you have the domestic and the regional infrastructure, providers moving to ISO 20022, and to manage that transition along with the swift cross-border transition is again a bit of a challenge. But I want to bring in Alenka from NLB. NLB has in fact gone through this situation. They did, they were able to move, transition to the ISO 20022 a while ago when the bank was transitioning to the euro currency. So Alenka, it'd be really interesting to know how your experience and how you managed this entire transition, and what is your recommendation and takeaways from what a bank needs to consider.
Thank you, Vipin. Hello also from my side. Yes, we have already such experience regarding migration to ISO 20022. Namely, in order to ensure more efficient, cheaper and easier implementation of cross-border in European Union, according to all these changes with SEPA payments, we have to adopt also domestic standard to ISO 20022. So as NLB is the biggest bank in Slovenia, so we have even greater responsibility to be on time and successfully adjusted standards to new requirements. So how did we tackle the task? Certainly, first of all, a detailed analysis for the existing systems, especially in terms of connection with the execution of payments and payment systems, the impact of new standard on existing databases, processes, and of course, having in mind also impact on customers. Regarding all requirements from new standards, the time required, resources, costs, and an assessment of that we can do with our own staff and also with external providers which can do some of alignment for us. First step was complex, but it's really worth to spend time on this analysis because they are basis for all other steps in these projects. So first steps was followed with the most difficult phase. It's prioritization of development task that will simultaneously planned and occupied by the same staff in the bank. This is sometimes painful because you have to decide either to drill on the project which is really business oriented and either to follow up with other project which is mostly mandatory driven. So according to the migration timetable, we were forced to suspend all projects that we don't have mandatory or legal requirements and require the same staff as the migration project did. This was the decision that we must take because we have limited time and especially limited resources and staff. On the basis of all this information and also on the prioritization of the projects in the bank, we also decide a method of migration. And according to the circumstances and also available infrastructure, our decision was that we assure the same information and standard to the customers with the 2022. This new communicator will also be able to adopt to the new standard within the timeline. Such approach required, of course, constant communication with both project team in the bank and also with external contractors, so that we were able to follow the timeline of the migration. And of course, there were also a lot of collaboration with the biggest companies, which were also preparing for new standard and were also adopting their internal applications. Because of the changes that also Andrew mentioned, it means new terms, new processes, changes in the processes. Very important role was also to educate our people in the bank, that they understand the changes, that they understand all the new terms and so on, so that they also can help companies in the migration to new standards. Finally, what are the key findings? Within 2 years, in spite of that this was quite huge project, all domestic standards were replaced by ISO 20022. And in the next couple of years, also corporate customers switched to new standards. Why? Because in meanwhile also the regulation in EU changed, and also relation between bank and customers should be supplied with new standards. The third finding was also that if I look from today's perspective, when we have also the essence of a larger offer of different platforms, APIs, web solutions, and so on, we would definitely opt for an external provider for the communication, converter, and for all applications that do not require knowledge of our own application. It means that we spare our staff, which is dedicated in our application for other projects, and develop all standard applications by outside providers. This is my experience in migration from domestic standards, and I hope that all this will also help us in migration from SWIFT to ISO 2024 international payments, and of course all these new technology platforms that are now able and were not 10 years ago.
Great. I think I'm sure you're now a veteran in this transition, so this new transition for SWIFT should probably not take as much of effort as what happened earlier. But it's very interesting the way you have structured the entire the process, and the most important part is the analysis, as you've mentioned, which is where banks need to be able to evaluate the time, resources, and costs. But also very important that I can what you mentioned is how bank would deal with their legacy infrastructure and the ability to connect to these legacy infrastructure, your legacy systems mainly. It's quite important then, rather than spending the time on developing things internally, you might as well work with specialized system providers or translators, and then move on with the project. So yes, definitely very insightful there. Now, on that point, the next challenge, in fact, that we are seeing is essentially this, which is the legacy infrastructure that a lot of banks have to deal with. The challenge that they see is in terms of, one is how can they work with a monolithic architecture, that has been sitting in there, in the back office for long term. And the other is, of course, the expense that they would have, the cost in overhauling this entire infrastructure. So I want to bring in Daniel from APS Bank. Daniel, at APS, you are now in the process of this transition. You were looking at the ISO 20022 migration, and you've not done this before, as I understand. So very interesting to know from you as to how you are approaching this, and also the challenge that you would have faced with regards to legacy infrastructure.
So, hi, yes, thank you, Vipin, and hello to all participants. Yes, unfortunately, I think legacy systems is one of the major challenges that banks will be facing with this migration. As Alenka also mentioned in answering the question, banks are facing a large number of projects, a large number of requests, and therefore sometimes modernizing the infrastructure always takes low priority, because ultimately to the end result, to the bottom line, this might not be impacting directly, so it keeps getting not prioritized. However, therefore, unfortunately, this modernization might make appear this migration to the ISO 20022 a bit bigger, because it's not just now the migration and the transition that banks are looking into, but also the upgrading of the legacy systems, which in itself present a very big challenge. Some banks are still having a number of systems generating payments, so this would be a major challenge, because there are a number of changes that need to happen. And unfortunately, this challenge might be hindering banks such as ourselves to leverage the opportunity of ISO 20022. And yes, I did call this an opportunity, because I believe that if banks look at this as an opportunity to improve the payments infrastructure, and as an end result, improve customers' life, then yes, there are a number of opportunities that can be reaped. Unfortunately, if we look at it as just a regulatory compliance that we need to achieve, another box to tick, we might miss these opportunities. Thankfully, I think that to help with the migration of the legacy infrastructure, there are platforms such as the one that Fiorano will be presenting that help mitigate this major challenge, which will make this transition easier and allow us again to focus on the important thing of the ISO 20022, which is improving customer migration, customer experience, and not just ticking another box. With regards to the modernization, I would also mention the cloud. The cloud is something that unfortunately banks tend to look at as something scary, maybe due to security or data protection, etc. But I believe that now we are all aware of the security mechanisms that such cloud providers are implementing to secure the data, to protect the data. So cloud is another thing that we should be looking into in our efforts to modernize. Opting for clouds would allow us to better leverage our resources, because having a cloud provider would take off part of our responsibility, part of our work, being scalability, upgrade, maintenance, etc., and allow us to focus more on what really matters, which would again be making most out of the ISO 20022 for our customers. Because at the end of the day, if we don't improve the life of our customers, it would be another project which would be useless, another major initiative, another major investment, which would be useless. I hope I answered your question, Vipin.
Great, thanks, Daniel. And very interesting how you mentioned that this is an opportunity, in fact, for a bank. And really, banks should be looking at this as an opportunity rather than just a minimum compliance or a cost event, really. But it's also interesting that you mentioned about the solutions to working with legacy infrastructure is a solution like Fiorano's. And Fiorano offers a smart middleware which helps a bank accelerate its entire transition. Now, I want to bring in Biju to talk more about this. Biju, as you know, as a solution, you would have, of course, worked with a lot of financial institutions facing this very challenge. Now, what are your experiences, and how would banks, how can they actually overcome this challenge with a solution like Fiorano's?
Thank you, Vipin, and really excited to be here. So you're right. So legacy is a bit of an issue in many countries. There are lots of systems all over the world that are used to speaking in the MT language. So what Fiorano has is a translation platform, which is quite similar to what Alenka alluded to in terms of a converter as a middleware. But quite uniquely, what we're able to do is we've been able to bring in the canonical ISO data structure into the core of the Fiorano translation platform. What that means is that from a bank standpoint, the benefits you get are huge because we are able to implement very quick and rapid standardization and coexistence of systems. So what that means is for the foreseeable time to come, a bank can continue using systems that are pushing data out in an empty format and yet begin to extract benefits of the rich ISO 222 messages. And they can do that without affecting large-scale change, which means they can change when it is when it's the right priority. We're able to do this by introducing internal harmonization that is based on ISO 222. And typically that would be the first step in adoption. And what that allows a bank to do is pretty much be in step with external harmonization activities that are being undertaken by SWIFT, as an example. So if you look at the diagram that's on the screen, the bit that says internal harmonization typically represents existing banking applications that can continue to publish messages in the formats they're used to. Whereas the Fiorano platform will internally translate everything in real time to ISO 222. And like I said, become the first step towards harmonizing with the external entities such as SWIFT and, as example, SEPA, right? But this is a very safe and economical approach, which quite uniquely offers the benefit of starting small, starting without spending crazy amounts of money by being forced to change your systems, and yet adds value by introducing the rich ISO data by virtue of the fact that we are canonical. And we believe this kind of a toolkit, such as ours, needs to form a key part of any bank's translation journey. The Fiorano platform is self-attested to Swift CBPR plus specifications. We are on the Swift website. But what we also support multiple schemes. So it's not only limited to just CBPR plus. But like I said, yeah, the big benefit with us is that as a bank, you can continue to keep your legacy systems as they are, yet adopt ISO in a very easy and low risk format. Back to you, Vipin.
Great, thanks. That sounds like, I think something that a lot of banks have been waiting for, and especially tackling this sort of a legacy infrastructure problem. But one point, where a lot of banks would be looking at this as a tactical rather than more strategic. Now, again, going back to what Alenka mentioned, that they use translators around, let's say, 6 to 7 years ago. Now, what has changed, and what does Fiorano offer now? What is the enhancements, and how can a bank really look at this as a strategic tool rather than just a tactical, connector?
So what is different is what we offer is way more than just translation. So the translation of MT to MX and back is really our starting point. The real value we're able to add is because of the canonical nature of our platform, where the entire ISO data set, the entire definition has been preloaded, which means we can accelerate journeys for compliance very, very quickly. But more importantly, help banks move beyond compliance. Because like Andrew and like Alenka and Daniel outlined earlier, the value in ISO is not just the immediate like-for-like translation, That's a very short-term intermediary step. The value is to be able to extract data, extract insights, and do more with the data. And I think slightly conscious of time, so I don't want to take too much time on data right now, but I know Vipin, you're going to address it, so maybe we can cover that in your next point, if that's okay. But the value, the change has been canonical and data.
Great. Perfect. Thanks, Biju. And yes, like rightly said, data is the key word here, and that in fact is one of the other challenges that we are seeing, which is the data remediation process. A lot of banks are still in, basically deciding as to whether they need to convert or transition the historic data, or just work with the new payment transactions and convert those to ISO 20022. Now, at this point, again, I want to bring in Daniel, because as APS Bank, you are in the process of this transition. How do you see the data? How are you approaching the data remediation process?
Vipin, as you mentioned, this is a very big challenge, and the main challenge is because we are moving from free text fields where you can input various different kind of text, where we are going to a standard. So that makes it challenging when you're looking into the migration. So at the moment, what we are also doing is we are looking into the gaps to seeing what missing information we have, to see if we can migrate the current transaction data to the new ISO format, because the new ISO format is introducing new elements which before were not present, such as, for example, the ultimate debtor or ultimate creditor. These are making the data mapping and migration exercise a big challenge. One thing that we're also doing is we are checking our systems, our audits, to see if customers tend to look a lot at past data, because something that we are seeing also from our customers is that in general payments, once a payment is sent and acknowledged, customers rarely go back to check on these transactions. It's more sort of when they get the assurance that the payment was successful, it's sort of a done thing and rarely is referred back to again. So we are assessing the value that such data remediation would return, because as I'm mentioning, and as you rightly pointed out, it's a very big challenge to do this migration. So we are asking ourselves, is it worth going back to convert the past payments, or should we focus on all our energies on getting this right and again reaping the benefits that can come from this migration? Another issue with the data remediation is that we are also going through our channels which can generate the payments. So, because of course, all of these needs to be standardized. Thankfully, for us, this is not the biggest challenge, because we just have two main portals which can generate payments, and then these communicate with our core banking system, which is responsible to generate the payment. So, although this is not the biggest challenge for us, it's also something that we're looking into, because it's of course something that needs to happen. But as for the data migration, as a bank, we are still positioning ourselves with regards to this strategy to see if it's worth or not going through that effort. One strategy might be leave the current transactions as is and then start afresh once we finalize this migration.
Right.
If I can add, right, I think it's a really good point. So data remediation, data fidelity, data strategy is critical, and it's all about the data, right? So like Daniel mentioned earlier, we need to think beyond just compliance. We need to think about the opportunity value of the richer data. And one thing I wanted to bring just to note is, I don't know how many of you saw it, but just 2 weeks ago, I was very surprised to read about an acquisition in the US by a 23-person startup called JICO, Jiko. They acquired a 63-year-old regulated national retail bank, which sounds quite surprising. It's not the first one, but it's one of the very early ones we've seen. And it's just about those new value propositions, which are based on data. Across the UK and Europe, because of open banking, we have seen some phenomenal, really interesting innovation examples, which is just going back to the point that if you're a traditional bank, you can't stay tactical. So coming back to the point about data remediation, The Fiorano toolset definitely offers ways and means to accelerate and make sure the data is not lost and during step up or step down. And that's fairly easy. But the real thing to think about is how can you think about this more strategically? How can you leverage the data? Data is the new gold. The ISO defines, I mean, up till now in the world of banking, we've not really had a common uniform data standard like ISO 20022. We have that now, right? And Swift is doing a phenomenal job of standardizing externally the rollout of ISO. But yeah, as a bank, it's very, very important to think about how to internalize and gain advantage from this rich format.
Great. I think, at this very point, since you've talked about Swift, I want to bring in Andrew to talk some more about the data strategy and how important is it for a bank to really consider it, like which you mentioned that you need to look at it as a long-term strategy. Andrew, your comments on, how important it is for banks to look at even, the historic data and consider the migration.
It's very kind of you to give me that question, but I'm always wary about trying to teach banks how to be great banks. I mean, you're doing a great job of that by yourselves. That said, the subject of ISO 20022 as a lens through which to gain insights from the vast amounts of data that we have already amassed over 40 years of doing payments for our customers using the old techniques and technologies is something that we as standardizers, of course, are very keen on. And in quiet moments when nobody's listening, that's kind of what we talk about. Of course, as Daniel and Alenka were saying, this is difficult stuff. To look at historic data through an ISO 20022 lens requires a decent sized amount of work to equip that lens with a map that says, this is what ISO 20022 defines as the data set in a transaction. And that is how it maps to the individual data fields and elements in this database. Without doing that hard work, this all looks great on PowerPoint, but may not be achievable. And I am not going to try and make any representation that this is easy stuff to do. Is it worthwhile? Well, we think it is, and by we, I think I mean the community. You hear all the time that data is the new gold, data is the new oil. The value that you can extract from analyzing historic records of how your customers behave given certain situations empowers us to do better and bigger things in terms of innovation of new strategies, new products, new services, and so on. All of this we believe, but it really isn't cheap. What I would add, just one thing, is that data itself, of course, is relatively dumb stuff. Sitting on top of data is a concept called information, which is data you can use. But I would argue that sitting on top of that is another layer of abstraction called useful insight. And that gap between information and useful insight is actually quite a difficult one to bridge, as well as just making data available in a well-organized data migration infrastructure. What it requires, of course, is somebody who knows what to do with the information you have, what to look for, and what stories you can extract from the information that's available. Now, we do know that that's where the value of large pools of data about our customers and their behavior, their customers and their behavior really lies. But I absolutely agree with Daniel, Bijou and Alenka that this is a whole new science for our industry. I would merely say one more thing, which is that without ISO 20022 as the canonical and globally acceptable way of defining the reference copy of that information, this vision actually would only work in conceptual PowerPoints. ISO 20022 is a necessary component of that kind of vision. And if it holds any water at all, ISO 20022 is the bucket.
Great. That's an excellent analogy. And I think the important takeaway is, like you mentioned, that's the ability to actually transition from information to insight, and something that fintechs nowadays are able to do exceptionally well. And the example that Biju talked about of a fintech taking over a bank might be a bit of a harbinger for the other banks to really consider and look at how they manage data and how they're able to extract this information. So yes, clearly ISO 20022 is paving the way for that. So yeah, that's definitely a strategy to look at. Now, very conscious of time, just want to move to the next challenge. And this is something that we've already touched upon as part of the first challenge, which is how a bank needs to prioritize its ISO 20022 migration. And the real constraint for a bank is the cost versus the resources. And many banks are struggling with the budget that they are allotted to manage this transition, as also the skill sets that are there within the organization to be able to successfully tide through this migration. Now, I want to bring in, of course, Daniel and Alenka. If you could maybe just talk about, and Daniel, especially in terms of, are you faced with a similar constraint, and how are you tackling this? So, what we want to really understand is, what are the typical cost considerations that you look at when you, plan this entire migration?
Yes, I think if I would say that we are not facing this challenge, I would be sort of living in a utopia, because obviously this is another big challenge that we have. And I think we all agree that cost cutting and keeping costs low is always one of the highest priorities of a bank. So whatever we are doing, although cost is not the primary factor, because we are always trying to do the best thing, but of course cost is something that we always consider and plays a critical role. Unfortunately, there are quite some costs to take into consideration in this migration, being the cost to implement any adapters or upgrade the current payment systems to handle the new ISO, but as mentioned before, upgrade any other modules or components in our infrastructure that needs updating before we can look into this. So the cost is not just about implementing this change, but enabling our architecture to support this change. If we would look at the TCO for such a change, would need to include quite a number of other things. Skilling, such as you mentioned, training our teams to learn this new language, as Andrew was mentioning earlier. So our teams are now used to the current standards we are using. So this is something that we need to take into consideration. The infrastructure upgrades, what would it cost to keep certain systems running, which might be reaching their end of life. So we know that for those instances, costs tend to run much higher. So yes, there are quite some costs involved, again, which might be mitigated by looking into platforms such as Biju was highlighting earlier, which would make sort of all of these changes, all of these costs sort of transparent to the bank, because they would help in handling the translation, whilst at the same time still allow us to get the new data, the rich data from this ISO standard, again to meet our objectives, which is leverage the opportunities from this migration, implementing a platform that would enable the bank to meet this objective, but at the same time not reaping the benefits, I think in a long time would be more expensive, because you would have invested a sum of money, invested a number of resources, practically, as mentioned earlier, for nothing, just to take a box. I don't know if Alenka would like to add on that.
Lenka, I think you're muted.
Lenka, I think you're muted. Yes, we can hear you now.
Sorry, I'd like to add that I also take this project also as a kind of opportunity. Why? Because I think this is also the right moment that in our analysis we go through with our application and really make an effort to judge how can we use all benefits from new data, because there is really many additional data in this new standard, and first also how we can reduce cost, while in our banks this will be the only standard for main transactions regarding payments orders. Now we will be able to communicate also with customer and also to process within the bank only one standard, ISO 20022. And this is also an opportunity that we harmonize our processes, reduce cost, and also maybe close some legacy applications because we have new data and so on. So maybe this is also one part of these all challenges that we already mentioned.
Great, great. I think, it's important, like you highlighted, that, when you allocate the costs and the resources, it's important to recognize the long-term benefits of this. Now, Biju, as Fiorano, I understand that, you are able to provide a fairly, I think, a convenient solution, if I may call it so, for banks to be able to, who are struggling with this entire cost and resource constraint. So would you want to just quickly take us through how, as Fiorano, you're able to do this?
Absolutely, thanks, Vipin. And that's a very interesting word you used, convenient. So what we've tried to do and what we've been able to do is make it as easy as possible for banks to be able to do a quick adoption. By that, what I mean is by bringing together accelerators and MT to MX converters that are more or less plug and play, we're able to do things quicker, faster, eventually cheaper, at a much lower risk point than a lot of other options. But traditionally till now, I mean, the debate has been, do I follow a tactical, yes, I'm just going to translate MT to MX and back approach, or do I follow something more strategic, which is really extracting value from rich ISO data. What we're able to do now, because of the canonical nature of the way our accelerator platform is set up, is offer both banks a two-step approach, which is actually quite convenient. So if you can move to the next slide, I'd like to kind of just quickly outline that. I think you got control of the...
Sure, yeah.
Lovely. So what we're able to do is actually provide an approach wherein we can start with a very tactical approach that is, it's quick, it's economic, it's and it's very, very low risk. And we can do this using, multiple pre-built adapters. For example, the CBPR plus converter and our MT tools, for example, that allow very rapid translation so banks can comply quickly. But in the same process, we're able to offer a very easy upgrade path to move from a tactical solution to extracting value from the rich new ISO format messages across the organization. We absolutely don't have time to go into too much detail today, but essentially it is structured at a very high level, like what you can see on my screen. So we can offer that, start small, do something quick, get compliant, and then when you are ready with your strategy, we can take you down a path, which is again very, very easy to adopt, which brings out the benefits from ISO. And just to kind of just add on to that point, if you can go to the next slide. So here's an example of some work we did last year, and we've been working in the ISO space for a while now. And this is initially with banks in the East, where what you see on the left side of my screen is a very simple real-time translation flow from a Temenos T24 system that runs MT messages to convert in real time to rich ISO and back. right? So we've been able to do this by the Fiorano adapter set doing a few things. One is, if you look at the right side of the screen, we plug into external interfaces and we can communicate with them in whatever format works. It could be APIs, REST, MQ, or FTP, right? We, on the other hand, plug into internal systems and then convert, will talk the same language they already have been. So in this case, the T24 system continues to send out messages in the standard OFS format. But Fiorano, as a translation platform, takes those, steps them up, and pushes them out. And what we're able to also do, and you can see our canonical components in the diagram already, is essentially store every single transaction before and after translation in a canonical format database. And that database then becomes the platform for extending data across the enterprise. So this is a way, and this works. We've got this running in multiple banks, but it's a very simple view of how easily we're able to do this. Of course, all the work, the planning, the analysis has to be done. But when it comes to implementation, we can do this very, very quickly.
So, when you said very quickly, what is the sort of timelines that a bank is able to achieve compared to if they had to do it the traditional way? It'll obviously change from bank to bank. But just to give you an example of what that looks like, from the work we've done in the past, post-analysis, we've implemented and gotten banks live in as quick as 6 weeks. Again, it'll change based on how big and multiple parameters, but it doesn't need to be too complicated. We can take a lot of that pain away by virtue of all these inbuilt adapters that are pre-configured. Right, and certainly a solution to consider. Now, we've looked at some of these internal challenges that a lot of banks face, but the last challenge that I want to touch upon is the external challenge of aligning your customers to your banks. Now, the first phase of this entire transition is aligning to the market infrastructure providers. And then the second is to align to the bank-to-bank transfers. And then, of course, is the bank-to-customer and customer-to-bank transactions. Now, a lot of banks would choose to ignore this or probably keep this as a secondary option, perhaps defer this for a certain period of time. Now, of course, very conscious that we're nearing the end of the webinar, but quick 2 words from Alenka and Daniel in terms of how do you see this? Do you see this as a strategically important, or is this something that you would choose to probably look at a later point in time? Alenka, if you want to start, perhaps because you've already undergone the ISO 20022 transition.
Yep. Well, from my point of view, I must say that our experience really showed that the communication with customers, especially with big corporates, are very important. Why? Because still it's all written in standards, how they look like, which data is important, and so on. But they still received many of the information from bank. So they must know how it will look like when we change the standard and so on. And the other, of course, many of customers are frightened because of changes, and somehow we must persuade them and also show all the benefits that they can use regarding these changes. And in some way, I see also this UniFix standard as a factor of improvement in many areas, because this new standard will also allow companies to get more data because of the extent of this, to lower operating costs. For example, if you imagine that our customers will have for all kinds of transactions only one standard, it means that they can optimize their processes in backends and so on. So they can also faster flow the funds, and all these advantages must be proper shown and present to the customer. And here I all see the great role of the bank.
Thanks, Alenka. That's very interesting. Daniel, do you have a point here?
I fully support what Alenka was mentioning, and I think that one of the biggest roles in the bank will be educating its customers, highlighting the benefits, highlighting what they will be getting out of this migration. Something that I wanted to highlight, Vipin, about the previous slide, which escaped my mind, is also the opportunity cost that banks needs to consider. As Bisho mentioned, they can do this migration in up to 6 weeks. So considering that 6 weeks compared to the very long months that it would take a bank to do this on its own, there's the opportunity cost to consider what other items we are missing in doing by spending those long months rather than weeks to get this done. So I wanted to highlight that because I think it's a very important point to consider when it comes to cost.
I can absolutely illustrate that as well. Just very, very briefly, if you'll forgive me, we have a team of experts in the standards group here at Swift who have been working on the detail of payment standards mapping for well over a year now, just to create the library of translation rules between MT and MX that we publish on the translation portal on My Standards. Mapping, to do mapping well enough to bake into a production system is an extremely long and arduous task. So absolutely, we know as well as any other firm what the value would be in being able to achieve a rapid acceleration of that kind of capability. We couldn't agree more.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So as you say, rely on the experts and don't try to do everything yourself. Great. I think with that, we've covered all the key challenges that a bank faces. Now, I don't know if we have time for a quick poll, but if not, I can see a lot of questions that have been asked in the Q&A section. And probably, I think considering the time, let's dive right into the Q&A. And the first question is from Praveed in terms of, I think, Andrew, this question is to you. To the point that banks should not see this as a minimum compliance, is Swift offering the service for free to facilitate odd banks to move to ISO 20022? The migration will be expensive. Can you please provide the commercial aspects that banks have to bear with or using additional Swift service requirements?
Swift is, of course, facilitating this global adoption of ISO 20022 at the request of the banking community. And, pardon me, as such, we are bringing a huge number of different resources, both in terms of information and tools and metadata and definitions to the community as part of our everyday job. We can't do the project for you. We absolutely can't do that. I mean, apart from the fact that there are more than 7,500 banks in the world who are directly impacted by this change, the different visions, the different infrastructures, the different challenges within each bank make this absolutely a project with a lot of individual specificities in each institution that will need to be handled individually. That said, what we are bringing to the community is, of course, the CBPR Plus definitions in computer readable as well as human readable form. We're bringing a readiness portal which enables you to test whether or not your ability to generate these messages is consistent with the specifications. And of course, we're bringing a translation portal to you which specifies the translation rules between the NTs and the equivalent CBPR Plus MX messages. We're providing a lot of training materials on the Swift Smart platform. If you haven't registered for that, I would plead with you to do so, because what we're also starting to roll out as of this month is a set of adoption guides, which we will also be publishing on the Swift Smart platform. So it's really important for you if you want to really learn not only the new language, but how it is going to be applied through the Swift products and services that you use. Swift Smart is going to be a really core resource for you. So if you haven't already got your Swift Smart credentials, apply for them. As members of the Swift community, they are absolutely freely available to you. All of this and more is available via the ISO 20022 Program Hub on swift.com, which is of course available to you. So yes, we are bringing an unprecedented package of information and tools and support to you as part of our commitment to you and to this program. And I'm delighted for the opportunity to make that clear. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Just a quick follow-on question related to this. Now, given that we already use the ISO 20022 for SEPA, is there a drastic change in terms of the language for customer transfer related messages?
It's not drastic. I think Alenka might have a rather more bank-specific interpretation of this, so I want to get out of Alenka's way. But essentially, SEPA and CBPR Plus and HVPS Plus are all examples of ISO 20022 in the service of payments. They share a lot of DNA, but of course they are separate applications, and there are small individual differences between the three schemes. Alenka, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, I agree with you. This is not the same, and also we must have in mind that version of ISO 20022, which is now used for SEPA, is different. That it will be used for new standard for SWIFT payments. So I must say that my presentation was only in way that how can bank approach to this migration, but it doesn't mean that we have nothing to do now with migration for SWIFT payments. Of course we have, and of course we also use our experience, but this will be the new project. And again, also changes in way and so on. So we cannot just switch from SEPA to new standard.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Sorry, yes, yeah.
Great, thanks Andrew, thanks Alenka. The next question is on the data remediation. What are the immediate benefits that a business could gain from from the data remediation, which is being executed towards the ISO 20022 compliance? I think we've touched upon it as part of the presentation, but I think probably, Andrew, if you want to maybe just talk about it.
I think actually Daniel's probably better at this than I am, actually having a lot more skin in the game, if I can put it that way.
Great.
For me, as a customer of a bank, it would be enormously useful to me to know how I'm spending my money and to compare the pattern with which I'm spending my money now to perhaps what I was doing last year or the year before. I know how my life works, but actually, do I really understand my spending patterns? Could I make them better? I have the same challenges with my household budget as many corporates do, although on a much, much simpler and reduced level. So could I gain insight from how my money works for me by better information from the one channel that actually knows where my money is going? Yeah, absolutely I could. And if I were able to look back in the past, as well as to look at what's happening in real time, then yeah, I could imagine making improvements to the way I live and to the way I look after my family. The same must be true of a large corporate, but I'd really like to hear from Daniel on this, if I may.
Great.
Andrew, I think you've hit it right on the head, because also we pride ourselves of being a community bank. So educating our customers is also one of our main objectives, and ensuring they manage a healthy financial lifestyle. So one of the main items we are looking into with this ISO 222 migration is offering customers better insight on their spending patterns, being individual households, like you're saying, especially maybe those that are not enjoying a very healthy financial lifestyle or are in dire financial situation. Maybe we can help identify items which can be improved or spending patterns that can be avoided. And also to our corporate customers, with whom we have a very close relationship, again, to help them identify their spending patterns, coming up with habits, seeing what can be improved, and this kind of information, this kind of education to our customers to always ensure they maintain a healthy financial lifestyle.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, right? And I think what Andrew and Daniel said were absolutely spot on. But just to add, if you think beyond the customer, if you think of the benefits for you as a bank internally, one example I really like, and it's not specifically around data remediation, but it is around the ISO format. And the fact, a great example is reconciliation. You are able to send an invoice along with the payment. A bank can now reconcile at the edge. Imagine the savings you're going to make in terms of reducing cost of investigations and all sorts of things that are happening right now, because that was just not possible till now. So there are multiple, I think, angles to these benefits. There is definitely a customer specific benefit set, but there's a bunch of benefit sets that are very internal to the bank that's going to help you run more efficiently and save money. And to be fair, I think we're only just beginning to see some of these really, really awesome examples come up. And over the next couple of years, that's just going to explode, I guess.
Yes, I think if I have to add, in terms of opportunity to be as agile as a fintech and to provide a sort of customer experience, this then becomes extremely important.
Yeah, so customer experience and reduce cost.
Yes,
right? Yeah, absolutely.
Very interesting.
Absolutely.
Great. We have just probably time for two more questions. So I think this one is to you, Viju. Will the ISO message be generated by Fiorano or just translation?
We can do both. We can translate MT to MX. We can generate from a core banking system. I mean, it depends on what needs to be done. Right, right. And I think this is a follow-on question. If a concept exists, on the ISO 20022 canonical data model, in both the business model and in the message model, which one do you use as the canonical definition? That's I must confess, I need to check with our engineers who are more platform-centric, and I can come back to you. Right, sure. Okay, the last question before we wind up the webinar is, now, is there a way to adopt ISO 20022 without impacting the core banking system and use some middleware that converts MT formats to ISO in the short term? If we adopt that route, how long could Swift support MT formats like a cutoff? So I think maybe I can answer the first part of that and Andrew can answer the Swift portion of it. So Vipin, if you can go back to my earlier slide, right, the one just before this where we've got a flow diagram. That is an actual example of one more. Here we go. On the left is an actual example of a real bank scenario where the core banking system did not have to change at all. And Fiorano just sat on top of it and converted in real time to MX and back. This was quick. I mean, this specific example was done in, I think, 6 weeks approximately. Post-analysis, obviously. But that's the Fiorano answer to it. It's easy, it's fast. Maybe how long will Swift support it? Over to you, Andrew.
Well, as you know, we won't support MTs in categories 1, 2, and 9 beyond November of 2025. So if you are doing business using the Swift network to reach your customers, your counterparties, or your correspondents, the external world needs to be able to interact with you from that point in CBPR plus ISO 20022 or ISO 20022 based APIs. We will issue specifications for the API channel in March of next year. That said, what happens behind the firewall, of course, we can't really see. But as I said before, I'm a standard purist and my vision is intact, that we will all think as well as speak and exchange in ISO 20022 by November of 2025, if not before.
Great.
Absolutely. And just to add one last point, Vipin, so whether it's coexistence or full translation, we support all of them and in parallel. And it can be via API, via message format. It doesn't really matter. Right.
Great, great. Perfect. Thanks everyone. I think with that, we come to the end of the webinar, and this has certainly been insightful and a very interesting conversation. I'm sure it has been helpful to all the participants.